James sat alone in his living room, staring blankly at the television. His parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving him home alone for the first time. He had been excited at the prospect of having the house to himself, but now that the moment had arrived, he felt a sense of unease. The silence of the house was oppressive, and James couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He tried to distract himself by watching a movie, but he couldn't focus on the plot. Every creak and groan of the old house made him jump, and he was constantly checking the locks on the doors and windows. As the night wore on, James grew more and more paranoid. He began to imagine burglars breaking into the house, stealing everything he owned and abducting him. His mind raced with terrifying scenarios, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Just as James was about to give up and go to bed, he heard a noise from outside. His heart began to race as he slowly made his way to the window. Peering through the blinds, he saw two shadowy figures creeping around the perimeter of the house. James knew he had to act fast. He quickly grabbed his phone and dialed 911. But before he could speak to the operator, he heard the sound of breaking glass. The burglars had found a way in. James knew he had to hide. He quickly made his way to the basement, hoping to find a place to hide. But as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw the glint of a knife in the darkness. He tried to run, but one of the burglars tackled him to the ground. The next thing James knew, he was waking up in a strange place. He was lying on a musty old mattress, his hands and feet bound. He couldn't move and he could hardly breathe. He realized that he had been kidnapped. Days passed. James had no idea where he was. He was being fed only once a day and he barely slept. He was terrified and alone, with no idea if anyone was looking for him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James heard a sound that filled him with hope. It was his mother's voice. He couldn't believe it. He started to cry and screamed for help. His mother and father had hired a private investigator, and they finally found him. He was taken to the hospital, where he was treated for his injuries. The burglars were caught and sent to jail, but James knew that he would never be the same again. The memory of his abduction would haunt him forever. He had learned that home is not always a safe place and that you can never be too careful. James's parents decided to move to a safer place where he could feel safe again. But James knew that the fear would always be there, lurking in the back of his mind. He would always be looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next time that danger would come knocking at his door. James struggled to adjust to his new life in the aftermath of his abduction. He was plagued by nightmares and flashbacks of his time in captivity, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching him. He became reclusive, spending most of his time locked in his room, too afraid to leave the house. His parents tried to get him to seek professional help, but James refused. He didn't want to talk about what had happened to him, and he couldn't stand the thought of reliving those terrible moments. He felt that the only way to cope was to push the memories away and to try and move on with his life. But as time passed, James's condition worsened. He started to have a hard time sleeping, and he would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and trembling with fear. He became paranoid and anxious, always looking over his shoulder and constantly checking the locks on the doors and windows. One night, as James was lying in bed, he heard a noise coming from outside. His heart began to race as he slowly made his way to the window. Peering through the blinds, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the darkness, staring up at him. James screamed, but no one was there when he opened the door. He knew it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, but the incident sent him into a spiral of panic and despair. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched and that he would never truly be safe again. James eventually decided to seek help from a therapist who diagnosed him with PTSD. With the help of therapy and medication, James began to make progress. He started to leave the house more often, and he even made a few friends, but the memories of his abduction would always be with him, and he knew that he would never be completely free from the fear. Years went by and James eventually went to college. He was determined to make something of himself, despite the trauma he had experienced. He studied hard and graduated with honors, and he landed a job in a good company. He was finally feeling like he had a future. But even though James had moved on with his life, he would never forget the night that changed everything. He knew that he would always be looking over his shoulder and that the fear would always be there, lurking in the back of his mind. But he also knew that he had the strength and the resilience to overcome it. He realized that his experience had made him stronger and that he could survive anything life threw his way. He had faced his fears and emerged victorious, and he knew that he would always be able to do so in the future, no matter what challenges lay ahead. In the end, James decided to use his experience to help others who had gone through similar traumatic experiences. He became a therapist himself and dedicated his career to helping people overcome their fears and move on with their lives. He knew that he would never be completely free from the fear, but he also knew that he had the strength and the resilience to overcome it and to help others do the same. Years later, James became a well-known therapist and was respected in his field. He had helped